I'm Jennifer. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is January 12th of 1992. I have a sponsor and I actively sponsor women. My home group is the Midtown group. We meet Mondays and Thursdays at 7 o'clock. Would love to have you if you're in Wilmington. I was reading the daily reflection and it says AA's freedoms. We trust that we already know what our several freedoms truly are, that no future generation of AAs will ever feel compelled to limit them. Our AA freedoms create the soil in which genuine love can grow. And that's what my experience is. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the freedom that Alcoholics Anonymous offered me when I got here, because I am just defiant by nature. I mean, I only follow the rules that I don't think are stupid, which are real limited, you know what I mean? Like speeding, the laws of the speed, they make no sense, so I just don't abide by them, right? And when I was drinking, it was even worse. But when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, what I got was like, here we are, take it or leave it, right? And because of that, it kept me coming back. If there had been rules or people had told me I needed to dress a certain way or act a certain way, and I mean, I assure you, people wanted me to act and look a way different than the way I did when I came to you, but I didn't get kicked out for any of that stuff. You know, I was welcomed into Alcoholics Anonymous and loved into Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm so grateful for that, because that freedom that we offer then allows me to stay long enough to experience the freedom that the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous have given me. And that, you know, the spiritual principles behind our traditions that they offer the groups, you know. So I feel really blessed that my journey in recovery has been with the type of, the first group that I went to, it was like God knew that group was going to be the group that I needed to be at. And the group that I'm at today, I mean, a lot of people say their home group's the best home group ever. I don't, because sometimes I don't even like the people that are there, but it gives me the opportunity to serve Alcoholics Anonymous. And even the people who get on my nerves ask me how I'm doing when I don't look like I'm doing okay, you know? And I'm so grateful for how we operate as a society. You know, it's really beautiful. And I can't thank Steve enough. He gets on my nerves a lot. And if you want the show after the show, it's after this meeting when Amy and I are going to get into it with him. And that's why I brought her, you know. Additional ammunition. I'm going to go prepared every time. And but man, he's fun. And I feel so blessed in Alcoholics Anonymous to have these relationships for people that I would literally do anything for. You know, I love Helm and Jeanette. They're just like the best people in the whole world, you know, and if they ever needed anything, I would do whatever I could to help them. And this group is special to me, you know, the foundation of this group, and seeing people that I get to see every time, knowing Daniel's going to be here every week, and, you know, if I show up. And so it's just really a blessing. And I'm going to share with you in a general way what I was like, what I'm like today, and what Alcoholics Anonymous has done in my life. And I grew up in Texas, right outside of the Dallas area. I grew up to a super dysfunctional family. That is not what makes me alcoholic, although I held on to that for a long time. And I thought a long time while I was here, well, you know, if I had been raised right, or if I had been, you know, given love, if I had received these things, if there wasn't abuse, if I didn't have a crazy stepmom, if, you know, all of these things happened, that everything would have been okay. And that's just not the case, because I've met plenty of people that grew up in real normal homes and they still end up in these rooms, right? And I also know that something happens to me whenever I put alcohol in my body that doesn't happen to somebody else, whether they were abused, whether they weren't abused, you know, none of that matters. But I like to be a victim for a long time. That's like where I, you know, hung my hat, is that I needed to have an excuse for me being the way that I was. And it was a lot easier to blame other people than it was to take responsibility. And Alcoholics Anonymous has given me this ability to take responsibility for the things that are mine, and to not take responsibility for things that aren't mine, you know, but to offer some grace and some forgiveness, which I didn't know how to do, because I'm a vindictive human being by nature. I mean, if you cut in front of me in traffic, I'm ready to slash your tires and burn your house down. That's just who I am naturally, you know, and that has not changed being a sober member of Alcoholics Anonymous, but I don't actually do it. I think about it, but I don't do it anymore. I haven't laid hands on anybody since I got sober, and that's a miracle in and of itself. The fact that I don't drink, another miracle, but I was a violent human being prior to coming to Alcoholics Anonymous. That was the response that I'd been taught and that I knew. And I was angry I think I was also angry when I was a kid. I just didn't respond normally. You hurt my feelings and I'd start slamming my head into a wall. Like, I just wasn't normal, even as a little kid. And I hated my red hair because I just thought, like, that was just the thing on the exterior that I separated me from you. Because I also believe that my disease of alcoholism is one of isolation and separation, and this red hair was something. I grew up in Texas. Everybody has big blonde hair, right? And I automatically was like, if I just had blonde hair, everything would be okay. I mean, that was the way that I thought, and I would rip my hair out of my head because I just wanted to have blonde hair, and I hated my hair because that's why people picked on me, right? It's because of my red hair, and so it was like, these are like the old ideas that I had to grow up. And I'll tell y'all now, just so you don't have to say it when you come up here, I know I have beautiful hair. I love my hair. It's my favorite thing about myself today, Things have changed in sobriety, but it is my favorite thing about, like, I'm always like, don't mess with I know it looks a little messy today, but I love my hair today, right? And I did not like feeling separated. I wanted to feel a part of, I think, as a kid, and I just didn't. And that was just this exterior thing. And sitting in meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, I hear people talking about other things, whether it was that you came from a divorced household or whatever it was that makes us feel this difference. But what I know today is that wasn't why I was different. I had a spiritual separation, and I didn't know that, or could I identify that as a kid. But my first drink was when I was 8 years old. It was with my mom. My mom wasn't around when I was growing up. I will say, in case I forget, my mom's sober today. She's 21 years sober in Alcoholics Anonymous because of rooms like this and people like you. And not only did AA give me a life, but it gave me the ability to have a mom who knows how to show up and be a mom. And that's still real weird for me. She was in town in February, and I kept trying to give her money and do things, and she's like, I just came to help you. And I'm like, I don't understand, like that. I just don't understand that concept, because that's not how I grew up, right? And I was like, I felt embarrassed, like, that I didn't just say, like, oh yeah, thanks, Mom, but the thing is that my mom shows up today in my life, and she didn't when I was a kid. She would say that she was going to be there, and then she just wouldn't show up, because she was actively drinking. And I was angry about that for a period of time in my recovery. And what I know today is if I had children, I'd do the same thing. I'd leave them. I wouldn't fight for them. I wouldn't do any of those things, because when alcohol's in this girl's body, it's the only thing that matters to me. And nothing competes with that. And the strongest love I think that anybody probably has is that for a child, And she just couldn't show up. But she did show up that night. She was mad at somebody, a guy. She always showed up for guys too, Mom, when I was little. But she was mad at this guy, and she grabbed me and threw me in the car. My job was always to make Mom laugh, and I'd do silly things to make her laugh. And she drove up to a gas station, got a 6-pack of beer, and handed me a beer. And I was tickled. I was so excited, because my favorite place at that time was the bar that she managed and she operated. And it was an old Irish pub. It was like nasty. I mean, it smelled like urine. Your feet would stick to it when you'd walk across the table, across the floor. And man, that made me want to be a waitress. I mean, I loved that place. It was my favorite place because everybody loved me there. Everybody was always happy there. They'd give me tips if I'd wipe the table down. And that's what I aspired to do. Like, I wanted to be just like my mom, and I knew that everybody drank there. There's pictures of me as a kid pouring drinks in the back, And when she handed me that beer, I felt like I'd arrived. I was holding that beer up real high, and at that time in Arlington, Texas, there was Cooper Street, and Cooper Street was where everybody would go and they would hang out, essentially, in the middle of the road. Like, everybody would just be lined up like you're going to drive, but nobody actually drove. But I was holding that beer up because selfishness and self-centeredness was alive and well at 8 for me, because I really thought everybody knew who I was, and I wanted everybody to know that, like, I got to have a beer, I think about those things, and those are things that I did as a kid that I look back on, and I think about the root of my problem is centered in this fear, but it's centered in self-centeredness, and that existed long before that drink happened, as I was constantly, and that's why I lived in this isolation, thinking something's wrong with me, because I was constantly watching you, and I knew that you were watching me. You were thinking about me. Nobody was thinking about me, and nobody's thinking about me today. You know what I mean? I mean, y'all probably are, because you're having to sit here and listen to me. But for the most part, when I think in my crazy head that somebody's thinking about me, most of the case it's just not true. And But I didn't know any of that then, and I didn't get totally lit. I don't even remember anything from that night, and I wasn't a daily drinker at 8, but I knew that that's what I wanted, because I always wanted to be somewhere else, and I know that grown people get to drink, and I just wanted to be grown. Wherever it was, I wanted to be somewhere else, and I just thought, if I was just grown, everything would be okay, because I felt real powerless as a kid. And when my brother and I were 8, we also ran away from home. The environment of which we lived in was, no kid should ever have to live like that. And I see 8-year-olds today, and I think, man, that's not what they're thinking about. They're like playing on the playground and stuff. And that's just not where I was. And at that time, my brother and I went and we lived with my grandparents, who were just good people, and they didn't retire and do the things probably that they wanted to do so that they could make sure that we had clothes on our back and that sort of thing. And I took that for granted for a long time. But when we were 10, and they weren't drinkers either, but Grandpa, he would keep whiskey in the house in case Grandma needed a hot toddy if she was sick, And my brother and I, we were about 10, he was 11, and he had one of his friends over who I thought was really cute, and so we decided to get this bottle of whiskey and go upstairs. I don't know how we knew how to play quarters, but we did, and we just went at it. And when that first shot of whiskey hit the back of my throat, it felt like fire, and it burnt all the way down. And when it hit the pit of my stomach, everything in my body just went warm. And man, that was a magical experience, And I'm just one of those people. If it's magical, I want some more. And that night, what proceeded to happen was, I finished off that bottle of whiskey. They dared me $20, and that's about all it takes to get me to do something. And so I turned it up, and that night I had alcohol. I was violently ill, but I experienced the magic of alcohol, and I experienced what would be stuck in my head that I could never walk away from. Because it like all of the stuff was fun. We were being stupid and silly, and all of that stuff was fun and all, but that wasn't the magic for me. The magic for me was when I was laying on that couch and the whole room was spinning, and you know that feeling when the whole room's spinning, you're like, whoo, and that was the first time for me, so it was like, whoa, and I was laying there and everything was spinning. My brother was yelling these terrible things at me, because that's how he talked to me, he called me terrible names and was super mean to me, and I could hear him in my ear holes, but like in here, in my heart and my soul, when he would say those things before, I didn't feel any of that. I was unaffected by him. I was unaffected by hurt. And that for me was the magic of what alcohol did for me, is it gave me the ability to not care what you thought about me. And I was always caring what people thought about me. When I was at school, I wanted to look cool. I wanted to be cool. I totally was not, I was like super awkward and weird, curly red hair. I was just kind of like, I was shy. I wasn't really shy, but what I know today is I was scared. Because I asked my mom one day, I said, was I shy? And she was like, God, no, and my nephews are, they're wide open. The little one, we're just trying to keep him out of prison until he's 18. And he's wild. And Mom always refers to him as me. She's like, that's your Aunt Jenny. You're just like your Aunt Jenny. And I'm like, I don't see it. I had to write inventory on him one year when he was 3. He was getting on my nerves. So there might be something to it. And he's just like, bah, 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 with his mouth. And I just think, how interesting, because how that felt at school was not this like wild kid. I was very withdrawn and very quiet when I was at school, because I was in this fear. And when I was drunk that night, I didn't have any of that. I didn't care about that boy who I had a crush on. I punched him, knocking him down the stairs. All of that changed. Like what happened in that time of me ingesting that alcohol, everything changed. I didn't care about my brother, none of the things. And I proceeded to leave my DNA all over that house. I was vomiting blood. I was violently ill. And I fell down the stairs. I wet my pants. And that's a good time for this alcoholic right here. And that's kind of what drinking looks like for me. But that's a good time, right? Because of that magic that occurred, of me not being affected by what you think about me. Because I was always thinking about what you thought about me. Because that determined my worth. And for a long time, even in sobriety, what you thought about me determined my worth. And because of the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, when it's talking about that freedom, that's one of my greatest freedoms today. is that my worth isn't dependent upon whether or not you like me or not anymore. I get to live a free person based upon trying to show up in life of what God wants me to be. And I believe me, I mess that up every single day of my life. But I know that I have a desire to be what God would have me be. And I didn't used to, even in sobriety, I didn't have that for a long time. I was just trying to not drink and not suffer. And but again, I wasn't a daily drinker at 10. I didn't get in a lot of trouble that night, but what happened after that was every time I could get my hands on any alcohol, I wanted my hands on it because I knew the solution. And it wasn't a conscious thought that I was like, I want to do this as often as possible. I mean, I didn't consciously think any of these things, but my body knew. My body knew what that solution was. And, when I was 11, I was already sneaking out of the house. We had older cousins, and we were getting into it, 12, I was definitely out every single weekend. I was out the window. And, I had a system in place as to how I didn't get caught. I mean, one is that my grandparents were completely naive human beings. I mean, my grandma didn't even know I was drunk. I was stumbling drunk, vomiting everywhere, wet in my pants, and she was like, well, if you're sick, go to bed. Like that. My granddaddy, on the other hand, he walked out, he smelt it right away. He was like, she's drunk as a skunk. Like he understood. But my grandma was very naive, and thankfully Grandpa was a heavy sleeper. Grandma not so much, but we learned how to be real quiet. There was a whole method to getting out of the house, and in my experiences, I was always hanging out with older people. That started super young because I never could identify with people my own age because I was too scared. I was too scared to have friends. I didn't have friends really. My brother would let me cart around with him, and they would like beat me up and pick on me and stuff, and like that was essentially my relationships when I was a kid. I didn't have any girlfriends or anything like that. And so when I was 13 is when I got thrown into my first rehab. And the things that happened through that process, I started getting into more and more trouble. There were consequences that started right away for me. And some of those consequences is that I started living my life at the age of 13 like a grown woman. And I was, acting like I was 30 and I was 13. And I was hanging around people that were, my friends. I call them pedophiles today because that's what they are. But at that time, I thought these were my friends. And I was hanging out with these people who would buy me alcohol and do all of these things. And the price was always worth it, right? It was always worth it to be able to have the freedom that I thought that I had. And it talks about that freedom to be able to drink. And that's what I wanted to do, was to drink. And so that first rehab when I was 13 was, I went in there and I was like, well, drugs are bad, just say no, because they had a whole campaign about it in the 80s, and I could that made sense to me. It's illegal to do drugs, so that's the problem. But I'm not an alcoholic, and you people are crazy. They would make us go to these AA meetings, and I mean, the whole thing was crazy in my mind. I just thought everybody was being really dramatic. And during that time, I also, when I was going, we started out, and this is the nature of who I am. We started out that we were supposed to be going like just there during the day and we'd go home at night. Well, they locked me up, like threw away the key, padded room, I think I was only there 3 weeks, and that's when I got transferred to that facility. And I told them if they let me out, I'd kill somebody. Like I was hot. I couldn't believe that they locked me down like that. And finally, after they transferred me, and I was in rehab for like 6 months. I mean, beginning to end, the day treatment to the thing, and then they transferred me to this other long-term place, and I kicked the window out of that place and took a little hiatus out into Oak Cliff in downtown Dallas, which if you've ever been, she's been to Oak Cliff, she knows what's up. I hear that it's different now. I don't know. I still won't go back to that place. It was, I knew right away that I didn't need to be there, but I was with 2 guys in a stolen Jeep that I'd never met before, and, it was like I knew right away. I was like, I need to get out of here. And so I called my 18-year-old boyfriend, and I didn't understand either why my family was upset about my 18-year-old boyfriend when I was 13. At least he wasn't over 18. But nonetheless, they didn't like him. But I called him to come pick me up. And long story short is I got thrown back into rehab. I mean, it was like this long stint into rehab. And they locked me down again. And so, like, when I was, willingly discharged from that place, I went and got drunk with everybody I was in rehab with because I wasn't an alcoholic, right? I understand how these other things might be illegal. But it's, in my mind, completely legal for a 13-year-old to drink every single day of their life. You know, like that made sense to me. And I thought of alcohol like I thought of water. It was a liquid, and there's no way that it has control over my life. And this is the mentality, and to me, to this day, it still makes a lot of sense, is that I meant to get drunk every time I drank. You know, like I wasn't trying to be sober by drinking. I was doing it for the effect. Like I wanted to be drunk. So how am I powerless if I'm accomplishing what I set out to do, right? Like it still kind of makes sense to me. But and that's where I maintained that power and that control. And the first step was really hard for me and challenging for me because of that reason. And so I went and got drunk with everybody I was in rehab with. And what happened to that until the time that I got sober, and I got sober 6 days before my 15th birthday. And, you know, what happened in that time is that my alcoholism escalated. And, you know, I was a daily drinker. The first thing I did when I got up before I went to school was I'd go in the kitchen and I'd get a big old glass and I'd put about that much orange juice in it, and I'd go into my bedroom and I'd pull out that half-gallon jug of vodka and I'd turn it up, fill it up, down it before I could go to school, because I needed that to get to school. And then, you know, whatever happened at school, and I would do whatever happened there as well. And then I would come home and I'd drink my face off until I was either passed out or blacked out. You know, and the end of my drinking wasn't exciting. It wasn't fun. I drank so that I could be around people and so that I could connect with people, and that I didn't feel scared and that I didn't feel any of these things. But my drinking ended up, I was alone, and I was drinking the majority of the time by myself in my room, set up against the door, and I was completely isolated. I had a couple of friends that were still around at the end. By this time, I was emaciated. You could count my ribs. I was so thin, and that's really thin for me. And I, by this time, I had bleeding ulcers. I was really sick, you know. And the thing about it is that it seemed completely normal. Like, I just thought if everybody would just leave me alone. And my isolation went into the way that I looked, right? Like, at that time, half my head was shaved. I wore combat boots. My eyes were black. My lips were black. You know, I'd put this white stuff on my face to make my face look really pale, like I was dead. And I was inside, right? Like, and sometimes I still am. But, you know, like I literally, my soul's black. That's what I tell my mom. She gets mad at me. But, you know, like at that time, it was one more thing to keep you away from me, because nobody goes up to the person who looks like kind of whacked out and crazy and it's like, hey, how's your day going? You know, you don't try to engage with the crazy person. And so the crazier that I could behave and act, especially at school, to keep people, everybody was scared of me. Because I would beat people up for no reason that were just trying to get books out of their locker, and I'd knock their feet out from underneath them. Like, that's what I just did for fun, right? Like, the way that I had fun was always at your expense. And it was always to create a show to keep you away from me. And that's what I believe my alcoholism is about. That's what it's about today. Because guess what? When I don't feel good or I'm not in a good mood, guess what I don't want to do? Go to a stupid meeting. You know what I mean? And be around you happy people. I don't want to do that stuff, right? Like, I have this disease of isolation that will keep me locked up. And that's why it's so important that when I don't feel like being in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous, I suit up and I show up and I go, and I'm so irritated when I get there. And I shake people's hands and I welcome them. And in my head, I'm thinking, this is so stupid. And by the time I leave, I have a freedom in my heart and I'm grateful. Like, I don't know why Alcoholics Anonymous works the way that it does, but I know that my disease is about isolation, and that's what my disease does to me, because the end of my drinking, that's exactly what it looked like. Was it took me to this place that I was so isolated, I got to a place that it made complete sense for me to take my own life, and it seemed like the only solution. And if I pick up a drink today, I guarantee you that's exactly where I'm going to get. You know, when I was 6 months sober, I came home from school, and my whole family was there, and my aunt and uncle, my favorite uncle, he was super cool. He was a guy with a Harley Davidson. He always had a beer in his hand. He'd let us have wine coolers, you know, like he was the cool guy. And they had gotten in a fight, and he come back, and she had been looking for him. She thought that he had checked himself into rehab because their whole fight was about his drinking. And she sent people looking for him, and a week later they found him behind the house, and he'd shot himself with a shotgun. And I was 6 months sober when that happened. And during that time, what happened for me when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous to that time is when I came in here, I crawled in here, I was beaten down, I had no ego, I had nothing left, and I was willing to do whatever you people told me to do. I didn't even know if this was the solution. I didn't even know if I was a real alcoholic. But I was willing to do anything to make the inside, because I couldn't kill myself and I couldn't live. And so I just kept coming to these stupid meetings with you silly people that it made no sense to me, but I was willing to do the stupid things. And what happened by the time I was 90 days sober is my ego slowly started coming back. And I started thinking, I'm not that bad. And I started thinking, I didn't get a DUI. I didn't have a car or a driver's license, but it didn't matter. And I started thinking, like, how stupid Dale was, because he was a millionaire and he drank his money away. And I just thought he was an idiot. And so this is what starts happening in the brain of this alcoholic as I start separating myself from you. I had connected with you and I identified and I understood the feelings and the things you talked about. And by 90 days, that ego starts returning and I start pulling back. And I'm not that bad. I don't need to go to that meeting. All of that stuff starting. So, and I talked a little bit about some of that stuff because the old timers let me know I didn't have a driver's license or a car and that it would be hard for me to get a DUI. Although I'm sure it's possible. We're pretty capable people. And so what happened is, I talked a little bit about it, but I wasn't fully disclosing everything to that sponsor. I wasn't fully opening up. And in my mind, I had what I now know is reservations, because I was thinking about, what about high school prom? What about this? Homecoming, like in Texas, football is church. And I'm thinking about all of these things that I'm not going to be able to do. And how do I do that not drinking? And what I know those things to be today are reservations. And I wasn't talking to a sponsor about those things, but I was having those thoughts. And so when I come home and I find out that my uncle is gone and we're sitting around the table, and we didn't go to church growing up. I mean, we were told to pray. The first prayer I learned was now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. That's scary, just FYI for kids. And so like I didn't identify with the prayer stuff a lot, but I knew I was supposed to, and I know I was supposed to be good, and if I didn't, bad things were going to happen. And so that was this thing with God that I grew up in, and how our family, and they become theologians that day because they were talking about how he wasn't going to make it to heaven because he had created this mortal sin, And I remember sitting there, and I swear, my higher power put this on my heart and my head, and it was the clearest thought I'd ever had, and it was that he didn't kill himself. He died of alcoholism. Because in that moment, what I knew to be truth, and I had started this process of working the steps, but I didn't know for sure to my innermost self that I was alcoholic until that moment. Because I knew in that moment, he did what I wanted to do. I didn't have a shotgun, right? I didn't have the access to the things, and I knew that he was in the pain that I was in, and I understood his pain. And it hurt my heart that last thing I had said to him was, you should go to a meeting with me. That was the last thing I said to him. And how fortunate that I was to have been sober. And so one of the sayings they used to say when I got to Alcoholics Anonymous was, some people die so that others can stay sober. And I remember thinking, that's kind of rude and mean, right? And then I experienced it, and that experience really shifted me 100%, because I dove into Alcoholics Anonymous at that, because I understood the illness of which I was afflicted with, and I finished that 4-step. I read that stuff to a sponsor. I did all of the stuff that I didn't want to do, because in the 12 and 12 in the first step, in the last couple of paragraphs, it talks about being on a life and death errand, and if we don't understand the nature of our alcoholism, that the only reason I continue to make amends, because I don't like to say that I'm wrong. In fact, my favorite thing is when people tell me that I'm right. And so I don't like doing that stuff. I don't like, I said it on the way here, I don't like writing inventory. I mean, who likes to write inventory? Do y'all sit around and do that for fun? Not me. You know what I mean? Like, I do fun stuff for fun. And so the things that I have to do in Alcoholics Anonymous aren't necessarily always enjoyable. The reason I do those things is because I have a life and death errand, and I know it. And for me, the blessing is to die, right? Because a lot of times I used to think, like, if I pick up a drink, I'm going to die. And that seems like the worst thing. And today, I've watched people come in and out of Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's not dying. It's not being able to get sober. It's not being able to have that freedom that we talk about when they're talking about that freedom. It's that. That's that worst place to be, is not being sober and not being able to die. Because that's where I was at the end, you know? And so I'm forever grateful that the experiences that lined up, they happened the way that they happened, because I don't think I'd still be here. They needed to happen the way that they needed to happen. And what led me to Alcoholics Anonymous wasn't like a crazy, insane night. I'd had plenty of those before with worse consequences. There wasn't a huge, terrible consequence that happened. What happened is that for about, I don't know, a month and a half to 2 months, alcohol had stopped working for me. And that pain of the life of just not being able to be free, not being able to have that freedom that alcohol gave me to not care what you thought, is to have these racing thoughts that couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. And I was insane. You know, it was the insanity of the alcoholism that just stayed in my brain. And that's what drove me to the place where I was sitting there, and I didn't believe in this higher power thing, because if there had been a God, I wouldn't have lived the way that I had. I would have had a mom that showed up. I would have had a loving family, right? Like all of these things. I prayed for my mom to be with me my whole life, and it didn't happen, you know? And so there wasn't a God in my mind. But that day, the pain had gotten so great that I was willing to say a prayer. And my prayer was not for help. My prayer was, if there is anything out there, please take me off this earth. Because I'd cut my wrist before, I'd taken bottles of pills before, and I had not been successful in offing myself. That night was different in the sense that I was completely broken, and I didn't know how to kill myself. And I just wanted to be removed from this planet, and I knew it was the only solution. And, you know, I said that prayer, and the next morning, clearly, I woke up, and what had happened a couple of months before, when I was in that first rehab, is I met this girl, and her name was Abby, and I never really had friends. And so she was my first friend, like girlfriend, you know, like I didn't have girlfriends growing up. I mean, I had like a few neighborhood kids that I'd hang out with, but I wasn't really tight with like a group of girls or anything like that. And Abby was this super cool, like, she was just cool. I just thought she was real. I thought the world of her. And she was trying to get sober because we met in rehab, and I thought that was silly. And so I would set up shot glasses, fill them up with water, because I'm a good friend like that. And Bill was like that too. He talks about it, you know, with Evie. And so the thing is that she eventually, through the process, she relapsed, and then she came, you know, she had gotten sober, and she'd carry around those little coins in her pocket, and she eventually said, I'm not going to continue to watch you kill yourself. And I remember her saying those words to me. And not once did I think, like, maybe I should slow down, maybe I should. I was like, bye, Abby. You know, I just sent her on her way. It wasn't a second thought, because the thing is that I'm always going to choose alcohol. And so when it talks about the ABCs of, like, there's no human power, I know that to be true in my life. It doesn't matter who you are. At that time, she was the most important person to me, because when you're 13, you don't care about anybody, especially your parents or your family, right? Like, you're separating yourself from them. And she was the most important person to me at that time, and I didn't think twice about sending her on her way. And so when I woke up that day, that morning after, I hadn't talked to her in 3 or 4 months. And I just happened to get a phone call from her, and she asked me if I wanted to go to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was like, absolutely not, right? Like, that's not what I was planning on doing that day, but I had this, like, pain in this. I was done. I didn't know I was done. I had no idea I was done. I just knew that, and I was alone, because at that time, the only people that I was hanging out with, I mean, they weren't good people, and I didn't have any friends. I didn't have any kind of connection or love or anything in my life, and so I think I really kind of probably went to that meeting just to feel connected to somebody, and I went to the Back to Basics group in Arlington, Texas, and I mean, it was a bunch of old people. And when I say old, I mean, even now that I'm old, even I think back to that, they were old. And like Santa Claus beards, suspenders, cowboy boots, you know, like all of them were, they were on their way. I mean, it was like, they were old. And Ken, he was like, he'd been sober since God. And all of them they'd been sober a long time. It was a bunch of old timers is the room that I walked into. And back then, you could smoke in meetings. The walls were yellow. It was fantastic. I mean, especially, you know, it's not socially acceptable, really, for a 14 or 15-year-old to smoke, and y'all encouraged it. I mean, I liked that about Alcoholics Anonymous. And so I go into this silly meeting, and I don't remember anything that was said that night. I know that I was in a lot of pain, and I know at the end of the meeting when they offered a desire chip, I got up and I got one of those chips, and in Texas, they're silver, and I got that chip, and I don't know what I said. I know that I cried. I don't know what anybody said during that meeting of what resonated for me. That's why it's really important when I'm in a meeting, I don't need to think about what I'm getting ready to say, because it doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm there and I'm shaking people's hands when they walk in, and I let them know that I'm glad that they're there, and I take time to find out who you are, and is this your first meeting, where you been, because that's what they asked me, I mean, they knew right when I came in that half my head was shaved, I was wearing combat, but I was a scary looking human, and I didn't look well, I was not well, and they knew what I was there for. They didn't treat me like a young person. They didn't treat me like a woman. They didn't, they treated me like an alcoholic who was really sick. And they sat there and they shared their experience with me after the meeting, and they told me about how AA used to be in those early days of sobriety. They would talk about what Alcoholics Anonymous used to be like, and they just tell stories. It was like my granddaddy telling stories, and they loved me into Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm forever grateful because I was defiant. Had they told me I needed to look different, I couldn't say a sentence without using a cuss word like 5 or 6 times. The F word was my favorite. It still is. I just don't do it when I'm in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. But they didn't even know if I was capable of that at one point. When I moved to North Carolina, they didn't think I could do it. But here I am. I am a miracle. And so, I was this unlovely creature, and I was treated like their favorite kid, right? Like they just took me under their wing, and they shared their experience. And I didn't know how to have fun. I didn't know how to do any of that. I really kind of did think my life was over. They told me to distance myself from people, places, and things. And it's not like I had a lot of close friends, but, the people that I was hanging out with, they would give me the things that I needed, and I would sneak out of the house. And so I'm supposed to distance myself from all of that. And it was tough. And I remember one night they were like, well, y'all can, because on the weekends we would have food fights, me and Abby would. We just didn't know what to do for fun. And we were telling them about this food fight we got in, and I put Vaseline in her hair so she looked silly for a good couple of weeks over that one. But, and we were telling them about this, and they were like, we have meetings during the weekend. Y'all can come to meetings. And so, and they invited us to go and to play Pictionary. And I assure you, when you're 15 years old, playing Pictionary with some senior citizens on a Friday night is not ideally what you're thinking you're going to want to do, right? Listen, that was the best night of my life. I remember going, and I was like, afterwards, they were driving me home, and I was like, I felt like I was high. I was like, this is the best feeling ever. We had just good old-fashioned fun, and I was like, this is insane, right? And for me, those were the little moments that God gave me to keep me coming around long enough. And I didn't know it was my higher power, right? I was praying to crystals. I was praying to all kinds of, and look, I don't knock anything. I've done it all. I converted to the Catholic Church when I was 10 years sober. And, a lot of my heroes were Catholic. And so, I followed and did what they did. And, I've gone to sweat lodges. I've gone to Buddhist meetings. I don't know what God is any more today than what I did when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous. And my prayers are very simple. I don't have to have this defined prayer. It's just not what works for me. I see some people and they're very devout in what their practices are, and I respect that. I used to be afraid of it, and I used to make fun of people like that. But what happened is I realized that was my self-centered fear, because I didn't feel that connection the way that they did, that there was something wrong with me. And that God didn't love me the way that he loves other people. And what I know today is that we all experience life differently, and it doesn't matter. And that when I pray to this higher power, for me, a couple of things happen. One is it reminds me that I need help. Because if you can't tell, pride and ego is a big thing for me. I like power. I like the way that it feels to have power. And I want to get that wherever I can get it. Right? It's not being humble before God. That's not what I think of when I think of power, right? I'm going to go shopping. Let's go do some shopping. That's going to give me power and make me feel good, right? Back in the day, it was always the boys, whatever it was that was going to give me the power to make me feel good, I wanted that. And I didn't want it to come from this higher power. It was always a last resort. I still think it's stupid when my sponsor asks me, have you prayed about it? I'm like, no, there's 20 things I can do before we pray about it. You know what I mean? That's when we call in the big guns, And so, like, that's kind of how my mind has always operated. And so, like, the journey for me is that it doesn't matter what it looks like. It matters that I continue to be willing to enlarge in my spiritual practice. You know, it doesn't matter what the spiritual practice is, that I'm reaching out to this higher power. When I was talking about that freedom, that's one of the freedoms that I'm so grateful for in Alcoholics Anonymous, is that all of us can have different higher powers. It doesn't matter. You know, and so a lot of that also happened, and that journey has happened through a lot of things, and sometimes it's been new people. But, you know, I started doing the deal, and I took all the stupid suggestions. A lot of things you're going to hear in Alcoholics Anonymous, if you're new, they're real stupid, and they don't make any sense, and it doesn't make sense how coming to these meetings is going to pay your light bill, right, or how, you know, I'm going to make a good grade. I remember going to Ken and being like, I was so stressed out about this biology test, and he was like, well, have you prayed about it? I was like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. Like, I was like, I've never heard anything dumber than that, you know? And so I did what he told me to do, and I prayed about it before I started studying, and I was like, whatever's out there, please help me retain this information. You know, I'd said the stupid prayer that he told me to do, and I studied for the time that I studied, and he said, when you finish, you close that book, and you, before you go to bed, you say, you know, ask your higher power to help you retain that information. And y'all, I got like an A on that test. I was like, Lord, you know, I was like, this works, you know. And so, like, thankfully, you know, like, taking the suggestions and doing the stupid things have paid off well. And I still think they're dumb today, but when I do them, I always am real surprised by it. I'm like, I've got 33 years of experience. You'd think I'd stop being surprised and stop saying that this stuff is stupid. But, you know, my ego likes to tell me that I know better than you. And Alcoholics Anonymous is about allowing people into my life, connecting with people. And one of the things is that my sponsor has no ill will for me. You know what I mean? Like, she's going to sleep tonight, whether I take her suggestion or not. And that's what I tell all the people I sponsor. I'm like, I'm going to sleep tonight. Do you, you know? I used to be real rigid when I sponsor people, and like, if you didn't do things this way, that wasn't real AA. And Alcoholics Anonymous has taught me there's a lot of ways to get sober, a lot of different ways to get sober, a lot of different ways to work the steps, a lot of different ways to understand Alcoholics Anonymous. Not every way's my way. You know, I know what I do with the people that I sponsor, but Alcoholics Anonymous has taught me live and let live. Let people, you know, give them the freedom, because my experience is that when I'm given the freedom to hang myself, I usually do, and then I take your suggestions on how to not do that the next time, you know, because I've oftentimes not taken the suggestions. And the cool thing is that I didn't have to get drunk over those things. I got to have these experiences that I now get to offer my girls and to share those experiences with them. When I was 3.5 years sober was when I moved to North Carolina. A lot of people who knew me when I first, they say that they knew me when I first got sober. I was like, I was 3.5 years sober when I came here. But that tells you all a lot about where I was at 3.5 years sober. But I was also 18 years old, you know what I mean? And my sobriety looks a little bit different. And I was doing a lot of inappropriate things when I was like 7 and 8 years sober, because I was, you know, heading into that 21 area, and a lot of y'all got to blame your drinking on that, and I didn't. I did it all sober, and I knew right from wrong and did it anyway, and so that's one of the downfalls of being sober young, I will say. But I didn't have to drink over any of that stuff either, you know. And during that time, I went through a lot of health stuff. I also went through a lot of rage with my father and that relationship. And I was about 7.5 years sober, and I was mad at him again. And I called my sponsor, and I was like raging. When I ugly cry, because I'm angry, it's not good. You know, that's when I'm ready to burn it down. And I was ugly crying because I was mad. And she said, well, when you're ready to write inventory, give me a call. Click, and hung up on me. And I've always had sponsors like that. If you don't want to punch your sponsor, I encourage you to get a new sponsor, because it's worked really well. I've wanted to punch pretty much every sponsor that I've ever had. And it's because they tell me the truth, and they don't care about my feelings. They care about my life. And that's what happened. And so I wrote the stupid inventory. And during that process, I also had a vision. That vision was when I was 8 years old, after I'd ran away. I had to walk back in that house and get my stuff, and I saw my dad, and I saw his eyes. And tonight when I go home, if I walk through my door, and that German Shepherd that I have that I love, she's crazy, but I love her. But if she doesn't greet me appropriately, we're going to have a talk, you know what I mean? Like, there's a way that she's supposed to greet me when I come through the door. And I don't know what it's like to have kids, because I never got to have them, and but I know how it feels when I go through that house if my dog wasn't excited to see me. And if I had a kid and they came and they said, I don't want to live with you anymore, I imagine that would be a pretty painful thing. And that day, what I believe my higher power gave me this ability to have some grace. Because I remembered what his eyes looked like when I walked through that door, and they were sad. My dad wasn't a sad person. My dad's an angry person like me, and it was sadness. And so it didn't forgive the things that happened, but what it did is it gave me the willingness to write inventory one more time, because I'd written a lot of inventory on him, and I prayed a lot. It was that he would die and he would be alone and he would suffer and he would feel what it felt like to be me, right? Because up to that time, my worth was based upon whether or not my dad loved me, and his love had to be determined what I thought a father should be as a father. And my dad will never be that person. But my worth isn't dependent upon him anymore. And what happened through the course of me writing that inventory and being willing to do it one more time, because there was great pain in that relationship. And I was willing to do it. And so my sponsor, when I got to that 9th step, she said, I need you to start calling him on a regular, or sending him a card on a regular basis. And so I started with cards. I did that for a year and a half, and then I went to calling him. And when I was 26, I found out I had a hole in my heart, and I didn't have a wall in between my right and left atrium, and they had to do open heart surgery. And at that time, I'd been calling him for a while, and I called him and I said, Dad, I have to have open heart surgery. And he said, I'll be there. And I was like, whatever. Like in my mind, I was like, he's not going to be here. And that surgery happened a week later, and he flew in. And before I had that surgery, I got to look him in the eyes. And what happened from that process of me starting that inventory to me the day that I had that surgery, and when I looked at him and I told him he deserved to have a better daughter than the daughter that I'd been, I meant it. I meant it with everything that was inside me, and I don't know how that changes, because who I am is I will burn your house down, right? Like, who I am is I want you to feel suffering and pain. I don't want to meet you in a place of grace. That's not who I am, but God changed my heart through the process of doing the work. The work was uncomfortable. A lot of times I didn't know what to say to him. A lot of times I didn't know what to do, or how to behave, or how to act, or what, it felt uncomfortable. And my experience in recovery is if you're not uncomfortable, you're not doing recovery, because it's uncomfortable. It's always uncomfortable. It's still uncomfortable for me. Sometimes I go to work events, I'm like, this is so stupid. I don't want to see these people. I don't want to talk to these people. I know I need to be reaching out my hand, and it's stupid. I just went on this work trip because I won this award, and I got to go to this fancy place with work. It's one of the blessings of recovery. And everybody's drinking. Like this girl, she had a Xanax and 4 drinks in at 6 a.m. I was like, see, I mean, she's normal. Like, why can't I do this? I'm not that bad, right? Like, anyway. But I'm with all these work people, and it's like, okay, how can I be helpful in this situation? How can I make other people feel comfortable? Because I was the only person who was there alone or whatever, and so y'all taught me to do that, and the work is uncomfortable, and so thank God I did that work, because I got to make those amends to my father. And up to that point, my dad never even called me on birthday, Christmas. He never called me, period. And if my dad doesn't hear from me for a period of time, I get a phone call from him. I have a relationship with him. A couple of years ago, he made amends to me, and I thought it was going to look way different, because I'd replayed this in my head of what was going to happen. I don't know if y'all do that, but I have full-on relationships with people that aren't even real, and it wasn't the way it was. It was very anticlimactic. It was very just like, interesting. I called my mom. I was like, you're not going to believe what happened. My dad apologized for something. My dad told me all he did was give me a roof over my head, and he never showed up in my life. It was crazy. I don't know how that happens for him. And I can tell you, my dad hasn't changed a ton. I love my dad. But he remains who he is, and it doesn't matter. I get to love him for who he is, and I don't expect him to be anything different. Because, again, my worth isn't dependent upon how he treats me. It's about learning how to show up, because I know for me it's important for me to be a good daughter. I didn't care about that stuff when I got here, but I learned how to be a good friend. I learned how to be a good sponsee. That's how I learned how to do these things in these other relationships, is that I show up not really based upon who I want to be, but God shows me who I'm supposed to be. And today I know I'm a good friend. I know that I show up in people's lives. I'm not perfect, right? And when I find myself resentful at one of my friends, I, do what my sponsor tells me to do, which is like put it on paper. And most of the time, I'm not showing up in the way that I think I should. And everything that I've ever resented somebody for, I've usually always done it, right? And the thing is that everybody's always offered me grace. They've allowed me to be where I was at. Alcoholics Anonymous loved me till I could love myself. And so I owe that same thing to the people in my life, to offer them a little bit of grace. And sometimes I do it well, and sometimes I'm reluctant. Sometimes I got to hold on to that stuff, sometimes for a year, sometimes longer, whatever. It's a process, right? And but the thing is that I am not eat up with resentment anymore. I continue to work the steps and do the things that were suggested when I first got here. And, I recently just did a book study with a group of ladies. There was 8 of us, and we'd meet every week and go through the big book. And when we first started, I remember, someone in the group, it was the only person who had more time than me, but she said, I don't know how I'm going to have a new experience. I've been doing this for, 35 years. And I was thinking, same, like I know what's in that book, right? Like I've read through it. I've gone through it with a ton of people that I've sponsored. And the thing is, man, every week I had a new experience. It was beautiful. And that my life that I create today, oftentimes it's through reluctance, but what happens is God reveals things to me, and I got to have this new experience with these new people that I would have never connected with in that way had we not made a commitment. And that commitment was we met every week, and we went line by line, word by word, and we talked about it. We did when it said write, we wrote, and and I continue to practice these principles in my life. And to me, the reason why it's important, I was about 10, 12 years sober, and I went to this meeting, and one of my friends was there, and she didn't greet me appropriately, which is always like, oh my God, it's so good to see you. And so in my head, I'm thinking, did I do something that I wasn't supposed to, or say something I wasn't supposed to? And then I was like, no. And then I thought, maybe I said something to somebody else that I wasn't supposed to. And I'm thinking of everybody that we know together, and I'm like, no, I didn't do that. And then I thought, you know what? I don't need people like that in my life. I need people who are going to show up in my life the way that I show up in their lives. I don't need her in my life. And I saw her talking to somebody. I was like, I don't need her in my life. And by the time I got home from that meeting, I was like, I'm never going back to Alcoholics Anonymous. And so when I talk about this disease of isolation, that's what I mean, right? My alcoholism is up here. This ain't a problem today. But what it is what my brain tells me. And, I called my sponsor, and you write about it, and whatever. And I did the things that she suggested. And I called her and was like, and had a conversation like a grown-up does. And I'm not good at that. And so being vulnerable and just having a real conversation. And she had gotten in a fight with her fiance that day, and it had nothing to do with me, right? But my alcoholism thinks I'm real important, and it's going to separate me. So when I start saying I don't need that person in my life, or I start distancing myself, that's my disease, right? And so today I know I need these principles just as much, if not more. Alcoholics Anonymous has given me the ability to serve, to do things that I never thought that I could do, go places. I mean, I went, I've gotten to do some, I live a ridiculous life, right? Like, people who aren't in AA that come into my life, they're like, do you know, like, how ridiculous your life is? Like, the relationships I have, and they're everywhere. I've got a girl coming in town from West Virginia. She's like 70 years old. She's an old hippie. She doesn't wear a bra. She carries around a little stool because her feet are too short. She's so short she can't touch the ground. And she's from West Virginia. She's got a real thick accent. And she's crazy, right, as can be. And she's like one of my best friends. I talk to her all the time. She's coming to visit me to celebrate her birthday, which is April Fool's, which is really funny. And she always likes it when I say her name, Princess Kathy, from when I'm speaking. And people like that come to visit me to celebrate their birthdays because they want to be with me. What a blessing. And that blessing exists because I'm willing to do the things that aren't that I don't want to do. But I show up and I do them, and I end up with these blessings that, I'd lay down my life for that lady. She is absolute gold, and she's been such a blessing in my life. She's taught me how to be a better friend. And all of my relationships are like that. My mom and I have this great, we're going to the International together. Who's going to the International? Whoop, whoop. Vancouver? No? All right. No. I'm going to be having a good time. But like, I live this really blessed life. right? And it's not because of like the things and the exterior things. I like nice stuff, you know, but it's not because of that. It's because of the relationships. And I've sat with people when they've been on their deathbed, you know. None of that other stuff mattered. But what mattered was the impact that they had. And I get to carry out the blessings that they gave me. And a lot of our heroes have passed, you know. The longer we stay sober, we watch that go. And that's been hard. And but I get to live out the blessings that they showed me. And I feel so grateful for that. Whether you're new to Alcoholics Anonymous or you've been here a while and you're struggling, like my experiences, the answers in the book, and the answers in me being vulnerable and being willing to open myself up. You know, it sucks, but I could tell you the freedom was worth it. And that's from somebody who doesn't, you know, I don't do things the right way. You know, I like being defiant to be defiant. And if I can do it, I know anybody can. So I'm sorry I went a couple minutes over, but I appreciate y'all. Thank you.